The North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide, and it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASO a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASO was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. Welcome to the North American Society for Oceanic History video podcast. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. The goal of the NASO podcast is to bring you some of the best historians, professionals, and up-and-comers in the field of maritime history. Today, we're heading to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, being joined by John Sledge. He's a senior architectural historian for the Mobile Historic Development Commission. A graduate of Auburn University, he is a prolific author with 6 books to his credit. Mr. Sledge was scheduled to present at our conference in Pensacola this year on his latest book entitled The Gulf of Mexico, A Maritime History. Welcome, John, to the NASO video and podcast.
Thanks, Sal. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you on the video and the podcast. I got to say, one of the things I love about our conferences is the ability to bring in a lot of local people in and talk about some aspects of maritime and cultural history that we don't always get. And you were on that schedule, and I was really looking forward to it. And as I was mentioned to you previous to this, I was unaware of your wealth of work and really piqued my interest. And in particularly your most recent book, The Gulf of Mexico, A Maritime History, I find those types of works to be some of the most interesting. We had earlier on the podcast Lincoln Payne, who did his book, Sea and Civilization. And I have to say, as a historian who teaches a lot of history, one of the things I try to get away from is national history and geographic land history, and talk more about these systems, Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, Pacific. And you undertook that with the Gulf of Mexico. So I thought we would first kind of kick in here and talk a little bit about your background, why the Gulf of Mexico and your connection to the area.
Yeah, and I'll just say that Lincoln's always been a real inspiration to me, and I met him back in 2013 when he came through here promoting the Sea and Civilization, and I've really profited so much from his thoughts on maritime history and what it constitutes, and so that very much has undergirded my approach. As far as why the Gulf of Mexico, I really grew up here. Though I was born and raised in Florida till I was about 6, we moved up to the University of Montevallo in central Alabama, where Dad taught. He was a biology professor. But my father was from Mobile. My mother was from Mobile and New Orleans. In fact, as a child, she had lived in the Pontalba building for a while there on Jackson Square. So the coast was sort of deeply imbued within the family genes, if you will. And then during childhood, we'd always go to Mobile for holidays and spend lots of time there. And my grandmother lived on Dad's side, lived in a marvelous Greek Revival home called George Cottage out on Spring Hill Avenue. And it's a very comfortable Greek Revival rural retreat, or was when it was built in the 1840s. And it had been the home of Augusta Evans Wilson, the prominent Victorian novelist from Mobile. And Raphael Semmes had visited her chambers, as had, Confederate generals and luminaries in the 19th century. So I was always just sort of surrounded by history. I was literally breathing it in when I went there, and I'd go down in the basement and there'd be cannonballs from the siege of Spanish Fort across the bay. And Dad, as a child, had loved history and read widely and even talked to veterans of the Battle of Mobile Bay and things like that. And so as I grew up, he was always thinking about the Gulf. And as a child, he had seen lumber schooners in Mobile Bay in the 1930s. And so the coast to me was always just so exotic, so different from the upland regions of the South where I was reared. And I just loved to come to the coast because it just felt people were characters, living and dead. I mean, it was just a marvelous place. And then the gumbo and the shrimp and just all of those kinds of particularities, not to mention Mardi Gras and the distinctive architecture, just all of that really impressed me. And I don't know if hearten's the right word, but I will say during the recent catastrophe of the oil spill, I was interested when they interviewed a little boy over there who was about 10 in Louisiana. And he said, it's the end of our way of life. And I thought, how many American 10-year-olds even know what a way of life is or have one? But it really struck me that I knew exactly what he was talking about, that kind of coastal vibe that we all imbibe when we're living on these shores. So that very much informed why I wanted to tackle this, because I felt that the Gulf of Mexico had been underrepresented in American history and letters. We always talk about the Atlantic and the Pacific and forget rather that there was a third coast. And while I was researching my book, Jack Davis in Florida came out with his just marvelous The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea, which won a Pulitzer Prize. And I was so impressed by that, met Jack, and was able to talk to him about his work. And I felt that his work, though excellent, was primarily in environmental history. He really placed the environment at the center of the story, and I don't think that was wrong. But I wanted to sort of delve more deeply into the maritime history of the Gulf, because I felt that was still underappreciated by the public at large. And Jack certainly dealt with aspects of that in his work. But I just really wanted to drill down on that aspect of it, but also not just talk about ships and, as Lincoln Payne would say, flags and charts and things, but also how maritime history helped shape the three nations that border the Gulf of Mexico, the US, and Cuba, and how it influenced speech, architecture, cuisine, really shaped human culture.
I think that's such a big aspect. Just taking a snapshot of Alabama, Mobile, where you're at. I don't think people realize. You look at Mobile and it's like, man, it's got a really small coastline, but in truth, the Gulf of Mexico just penetrates into that region, thanks to Mobile Bay, thanks to the rivers, and I think that's one of the key things that we tend to forget is it doesn't matter how big of a coast you have, it's the influence that the sea has on the people and its environment. And that's why I think you do such an interesting element here by looking at the Gulf of Mexico, and again looking at that intersection of three nations, three groups that are in there, and of course there's many more than that as we'll get in here and talk about. But just a really dynamic history, and I think you're right. I think in looking at the maritime connection here, you bring together a very unique aspect. The United States is so easily taught from 13 colonies going ever east to west, and that's not the history of the United States. It's not the development of this area at all. And so I think looking at the Gulf is a big one. I thought we'd just take a kind of a chronological look through your book and kind of talk about it. And one of the first things you talk about is the Native American experience, how important the Gulf Coast was to the Native American. Again, for those of you not familiar enough with the geography of the Gulf of Mexico, it's basically an inland sea almost, except with two exits out of it, one south of Cuba, the Yucatan Strait right there, and the Florida Channel right there between Florida and Cuba. But basically it's a self-contained massive area of water with a very unique geography around it. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the Native American impact.
Yeah, no, and that's so important, because history often sort of acts like, well, history begins with the Europeans, and we all course, know it's more complicated than that. And in the case of the Gulf Basin, the Indians were so prominent, and of course their remains, particularly in the forms of shell mounds or mounds, are still so evident, pyramids down in Mexico and the Yucatan. And so I wanted to sort of explore, just in a quick overview, who were some of the most important tribes along the littoral, and what was their relationship with the sea, and how did it matter. And I mean, there were so many over the millennia that one could really not do it justice, but I decided to pick three: the Maya down in the Yucatan, and then the Mobile Indians in the Mobile, Pensacola area, who had a sophisticated Mississippian mound culture, and then the Calusa down in Southwest Florida, who had an intimate relationship through canals and canoes with the coast there. But this image is a temple mural from the Chichen Itza temple in the Yucatan, and it shows Mayans harvesting sea life. And I just love this image, not only for its depiction of these dugout canoes, which could be quite large. Some we know could hold as many as 30 warriors. And the Maya actually had an innovation with their canoes in that they had these high prows and sterns, which made them a little more usable with following or a head sea, as opposed to a lower prow or stern. So they were a little more perhaps seaworthy than just a log that had been hollowed out. And here we see them, the variety of sea life that they're harvesting. And then if you look at the architecture, the houses there on the shore, and that little center house in the center foreground, you can actually see a little basket of fish through the window there. So it's a sort of a quaint peek into the domestic arrangement, but also the importance of the sea to their culture. We know through their mythology that they worshipped a variety of deities that were prominent in the legends and myths of the Gulf Basin. The Huracan was believed to be a coiled serpent at the bottom of the sea that could sort of stir it up into a storm if you were unhappy with men. And then there was another god named Chak, and they had these cenotes down in the limestone there in the Yucatan with wells, natural waters, springs, and so forth down in them, and they would throw sacrificial victims to Chak down into these cenotes. And so it was a very bloodthirsty culture in many respects, with a elaborate priesthood that demanded human sacrifice to propitiate these deities. But they also had paddler gods who would convey the souls of the dead across the waters. And then they had this very compelling legend of Quetzalcoatl, the serpent god, who they believed had come to them from the east. And they had a very elaborate series of ritual and beliefs around Quetzalcoatl. And they believed that he was going to come back and that he was lighter skinned. And so when the Spaniards arrived with their beards and white skin, it was a catastrophe for the Native Americans because it happened to coincide with a prominent religious holiday. This was for the Aztecs. And so they tended to think that the Europeans were divine in the beginning, and that allowed them to get their foot in the door. One of the things that really intrigued me about the Mayans, though, I think anybody that's looked at the art and the architecture of Mesoamerica and the southeastern United States, if you're familiar with Moundville, obviously near Tuscaloosa, and those wonderful sun discs in human hands and those various kinds of rattler representations, rattlesnake representations on their artwork, and the way the people dress, the warriors with their top knots and their pointed pouches and their ear spools, they look like Mesoamericans, and you just think, man, there had to be some kind of connection or influence between those two cultures. And there's also the triad of beans, gourds, and squash and melons that came out, and maize that came out of Mesoamerica. And you wonder, well, how exactly did it travel? And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole on that because it just isn't clear. There's no definite evidence that I'm aware of that the Mayans actually traveled to southeastern U.S. And if they had, perhaps a waterborne trip would have been the most likely, because by land, that was an extremely long and forbidding journey over very inhospitable terrain. And it's conceivable that a canoe load of Maya warriors got blown off course, or that some sort of itinerant trader ended up through the southeast, and perhaps brought chocolate to the women and the children, and stories for the men, and somehow that's how it began. We just don't really know. There's some pretty interesting and a little bit wacky theories out there about people who claim to know more, but there had to have been some kind of connection. Of course, the most obvious one, the pyramids of stone in Mesoamerica, and then the earthen mounds in the U.S. But I was just intrigued at how these Native Americans had adapted so perfectly to their landscape. In the case of the Mobile Indians and then the Calusa in Florida, the sea was critical to their survival. They really were never going to starve as long as they had the resources of sea life there. And their population reached a point of stability with the resources that were available. And they lived in a very wise and balanced relationship with nature.
Well, I think that's a key thing, and I think one of the things that we're seeing more and more being done is a lot more archaeology, a lot more history on those pre-Columbian cultures. And you're right. Once you look at the geography of the Gulf of Mexico, you realize that it's probably very easy for, well, not easy, but it's very conceivable that groups could have sailed around the Gulf of Mexico, conceivably across the channel to Cuba and maybe on to Florida. And I think that influence is so important. The more we understand the pre-Columbian societies, the better we understand what this world looked like before the arrival of the Spanish, who again
Oh yeah,
are the equivalent of aliens landing in the New World, so to speak.
Very true.
And
Very
coming
true.
in, and I think the arrival of the Spanish coming in this map, I enjoyed this map a lot. I love good maps,
Yeah.
and great maps like this that, sometimes people look at maps like this and it's like, well, it's not accurate, it's overblown, but it's not.
Right.
It actually shows you how they use the waterways to penetrate
Yes.
into the interior. And I was wondering, you could talk a little bit about the arrival of the Spanish into the New World.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a beautiful map. You're right. It's the Soto map, and it shows the interior towns and the rivers so well. So it's critical for that reason. The Spanish arrived in the early 16th century. They founded Havana in the early 1500s. They conquered Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, conquered Cuba, and then moved into Mexico through Cortez in 1518. The Maya were conquered as well. Florida, and by Florida, they meant almost everything you see on that map. I mean, it wasn't just the peninsula, but that whole northern landmass. So first they had to kind of find out about the Gulf and learn its geography. So I was particularly interested in kind of vessels they used, the importance of the ships like caravels, what kind of navigational tools and techniques they had to aid them in this discovery process, and then how their cartography evolved along with what they were finding in the basin. And so, Columbus discovered Cuba and much of the Caribbean, but he never penetrated the Gulf. And he was adamant that Cuba was not an island, and made his men sign a document that it wasn't, on the pain of having their tongue forcibly removed. So, but other Spaniards knew better. And in 1518, Sebastiano Campo actually circumnavigated Cuba and really did discover the Gulf for the first time. And so then there was that entire wonderland around the littoral. And then they thought, well, maybe there's a passage to the Pacific there. And as they got into exploring Florida, they didn't find the gold or the silver that they had found in Latin America. And it proved to be very inhospitable for colonization. We know this. Alvarez de Pineda sort of traversed the northern littoral and mapped it in about 1518 or 19. And then Soto's Entrada comes in Ponce de León, and Tristan de Luna all attempted to colonize or explore Florida and really came to grief in some fairly grisly ways. Luna actually went mad and his officers deserted him, and there was a big legal case that went on for years and generated a mountain of paper, which is very instructive. But fundamentally, there was just no gold or silver in the Southeast, so they couldn't figure out a way to make it work economically. And the Indians were extremely inhospitable, but the rivers were critical. And one of the stories that most interested me was the Odyssey of Cabeza de Vaca. That, talk about an underappreciated story in American history. He lands with Narvaez in what's probably Tampa Bay today, and then they go up the peninsula. This is like I forget the exact date. It's early 16th century, and they end up sort of losing all the resources and starving, and the Indians are hostile. And then in the Big Bend of Florida, there where Appalachia Bay is today, they had to sort of figure out, how are we going to get out of this pickle? And they actually built 5 small ships and used their clothing to make these crazy patchwork sails and planks from trees, and just the labor must have been astonishing. And then they melted down their weapons and all for metal parts, and each boat would hold about 50 men, and then they put off in the Gulf. And so that really tied in with one of my themes, which was that for people to survive the Gulf, it really forced them to innovate in terms of how they were going to make a living or survive those waters. And so these Spanish were able to sort of bounce along the littoral there in these ships, got into Mobile Bay. And speaking of the importance of the rivers, the Mobile Indians came down to sort of see who they were and whether they were a threat. And there was a Greek and a black man in the Spanish party who agreed to go with the Indians as hostages. And then the next day the Indians came back, they didn't bring the hostages. And so there was a little bit of a confrontation on the water. And finally the Spaniards went back out in the Gulf and continued on their way. And of course, Cabeza de Vaca eventually was wrecked roughly where Galveston is today and went overland all the way almost to the Pacific, an incredible odyssey. And then that led into the whole Entrada of Coronado and et cetera. But what I particularly found interesting was when Soto came through the southeast and he's coming down the Coosa River toward the coast. Some of the Indians there actually showed them a dagger that they said had belonged to this Greek who had been a hostage years before, and that the hostages had been killed for some reason or died at some point. But where Soto was shown the dagger was over 200 miles inland from the site of the confrontation. So it clearly, the rivers were how the Indians communicated. They were how they got around. We know that their trade networks extended throughout the southeast and even into the up to the Great Lakes, perhaps the Southwest. So the Spanish basically wrecked all of that. They came in and brought diseases as well as fire and the sword.
Well, you're right. I mean, obviously, the transportation network, which was so essential for the Native Americans, is the double-edged sword. It allows the Spanish to do that. And you know, the story about de Vaca is always the most interesting to me. I'd pay a lot of money to be there for the moment when he returned back, and to see him walking up. And if everyone doesn't understand that imagery, you just need to really study. Go back and look at this story. It is a great story.
It is amazing.
This also goes to another issue here, which I think is really important to understand Spanish colonization of North America. And you understand why the Gulf of Mexico is their focus versus what the American colonists do, or the English colonists, I should do on the East Coast. There's no reason to go to the East Coast. It doesn't go anywhere. It's pigeonholed up against the Atlantic. It's not what they want. They want to get into the interior. And that makes the Gulf Coast much more attractive to the Spanish in many ways, because you have those waterways that penetrate deep into the interior, which is essential for them. But then, I mean, we do have this colonial crossroads, which the Gulf of Mexico does become, with the English, with the Spanish, Native Americans, and then French and Dutch and everybody else who's in there. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about this colonial crossroads that you discussed too.
Yeah, of course, the Spanish dominated the Gulf of Mexico for 2 centuries. It was literally the Spanish Sea after they conquered Mexico and Cuba and more or less abandoned Florida to its own devices. They controlled the Gulf, and that was consistent with their policy, which was let's dominate the basin. It was Gulf-centric. We can get the gold and silver out of Peru and Mexico and all the way from the Philippines to Acapulco and then across and then to Veracruz, and we'll transport it all on galleons to Havana and then across. And Spain enjoys this incredible wealth. But the French looked at this picture in the 18th century and saw the Mississippi Valley and just realized that this is right through the heart of the continent, and it's a chance to really penetrate that realm and hopefully profit from it. And so the French, of course, were in Canada, and they began moving down the Mississippi. La Salle makes his famous voyage in the 1680s and makes the connection that the Mississippi does go all the way to the Gulf. And so the French decide to establish a colony, and d'Iberville comes over in about 1702, and they establish Mobile, Biloxi, eventually New Orleans in 1723. And the idea is to have other outposts along the Mississippi that would link up with Canada and essentially hem the British in on the eastern seaboard, and then allow the French to dominate trade throughout the Mississippi Valley, the fur trade, particularly in hides, which were so important in the 18th century. And so the Spanish looked at this, and the British looked at it. Spanish were particularly alarmed. They called it the French thorn, and they wanted to immediately remove it. The British were interested and had their own colonization schemes, but the French were pretty firmly entrenched. And in fact, there were a series of colonial wars between all 3 of those powers. And this map actually shows what happened after the French and Indian War. When the French were kicked from the continent, the British, the pink area was their original 13, and then they gained all the way over there to the Canada and the Mississippi River, and then New Spain, where the Spanish were, would come over the Mississippi. And of course, the Spanish would have New Orleans, which was actually on the east side of the Mississippi River. But so it was like a game of musical chairs along the Gulf Coast, because cities like Mobile and New Orleans, Pensacola were really changing hands every so many decades between French, Spanish, British. And it made the cartography very vexing, I'm sure, for many of those map makers. But they all wanted to try to find out how to dominate the American continent, because they thought that there were just huge profits to be made. And so the 18th century was very fraught and terrifically violent as well, because there were sieges of Mobile and Pensacola. There was a British siege and occupation of Havana in 1762, as they all vied for control, ultimately of the Gulf, and particularly those rivers.
Well, I think that river system, as you talk about it, is so important. Again, we go back to this idea, the concept that Minnesota is a Gulf of Mexico state in many ways, because it has that connection to it. And it's true. Like you said, the French realized that very quickly, the way that dominate in that, and again, what we're talking about is that valley between the Rockies and the Appalachian Mountains all dump out into that area. And it's so essential and becomes this battleground. So you get this great little kind of military history. And more importantly, like you said, it creates a very unique culture, this fusion of Spanish, French, English, Native American. You start bringing, of course, the African slaves over, and you start creating such a unique environment around the Gulf of Mexico coast that's just amazing. When you initially were talking at the very beginning of this, you were talking about Mobile, and I always love Mobile compared to New Orleans. I think New Orleans is so overdone. Right. But Mobile is like, if you want New Orleans done right, you go to Mobile, and that's the place you go. And I hate to say that, because then people start listening to me and they'll go. and it's good for you. But
people like to say that New Orleans, they do Mardi Gras for the tourists, and Mobile, we do it for ourselves.
I always like to go with professionals. So we can't talk about a maritime subject without bringing pirates in, and this is the bane of some of the members of NASO is we tend to talk too much about piracy. But I think piracy in the context of the Gulf of Mexico is very interesting, because I think a lot of things you're talking about here isn't just piracy, but also smuggling in some ways, and doing things outside the confines of the law, which was something that the Americans got involved with very quickly. So I was wondering if you could delve into that topic a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I have really a whole chapter on pirates in the Gulf, particularly Lafitte, Jean Lafitte, Pierre Lafitte, who were so colorful, but also deal with pirates down in the Keys in the Caribbean and Cuba. And they had a particularly fruitful environment when the Lafittes came along in the early 19th century, because all of the maritime powers were more or less fairly weak. I mean, the U.S. was an infant nation without a strong navy. Louisiana does not become a state until 1812. It's a territory before that. Of course, it's in foreign hands before 1803. The French, it's a very long supply line from France. The Spanish are distracted, and they have a fleet that the Armada de Barlovento that comes out of Veracruz to patrol the Gulf for intruders, but their resources are stretched thin, and there's this incredible wealth that's going through the Gulf on these galleons, which tended to sail on what we would call convoys today to protect themselves from pirate attacks. But you had corsairs and freebooters in the 18th century coming from Holland and England and France, and plundering this shipping, being very opportunistic. You also had people, logwood cutters down in the Caribbean and Cuba, and just sort of people waiting on an opportunity to strike any kind of ship. And then by the early 19th century, privateering comes along, where, because there are many colonies rebelling from Spain in Latin America, like what would become Colombia, Cartagena declared its independence from Spain and began issuing letters of marque to privateers to attack Spanish shipping, because they were at war with Spain. And so these privateers saw a great opportunity, men like the Lafitte's with all that Spanish shipping. But unfortunately, many of these guys were fairly unscrupulous and opportunistic, and they didn't just attack Spanish shipping. They'd attack any ship that seemed vulnerable. And what was particularly vulnerable were these Atlantic slave ships that were coming across to Cuba, which was Havana was a major slave port. And so they found that, hey, if we take a slave ship just as it's coming in the Gulf, then we avoid the danger of a transatlantic passage ourselves, and we get all this great profit in the form of these slaves without having to really do any real work. And so that is really kind of the dirty underside of piracy, at least in the 19th century. The Lafitte's, despite all the romantic imagery around them, and you can sort of see this image of, dashing pirates, they were really basically slave runners, slave traders. They were very opportunistic about that. And of course, they had just this yawning market in the American Southeast as the area opened up to settlement and cotton, and particularly sugar in Louisiana. There was just this amazing demand for slaves, and the slave trade internationally, as most of our members know, was illegal by 1808. So the Lafitte's just had this ready market, these helpless slave ships coming in, and no maritime power really strong enough to do much about it. And it was just an opportunity that they couldn't ignore. But they're very smart about it. They were headquartered down there in Barataria in the southern reaches of Louisiana, south of New Orleans, but west of the Mississippi. And basically, they just ran a little pirate kingdom down there. And despite all of that, he was a good neighbor. He didn't traffic in American runaways because he knew he would lose the support of the sugar planters. He always sent them back. He ordered his men not to harass the native fishermen around there. He didn't want to cultivate bad relations there. So he had quite a little thing going there until the Americans finally got strong enough to come in and clean him out, which happened to coincide with the British invasion of New Orleans in 1812. And so that whole story of how the British tried to take advantage of the groups like the runaway slaves and the Native Americans and the privateers and pirates, and sort of enlist them in their cause to turn on the Americans and allow them to gain dominance. So really that whole story is quite fascinating, and it was a lot of fun to tell.
It's one of my secret things I will always watch if it comes on is Yul Brynner as John Lafitte. It's one of the great ones. But I think what you portray there is literally the Wild Wild West before the Wild Wild West, and that's what the Gulf of Mexico sounded like in many ways.
Yes.
It's you're concentrating wealth into these vessels. They're the targets. They're on the railways of the sea, and you're attacking them. And again, it's opportune. It's opportune wealth. It's hard to see this amount of wealth, especially what the Spanish were hauling out, and the fact that slaves were equivalent to this, the price of a home, and if you hit a slaver ship with hundreds of slaves on board, I mean, that the mass amount of wealth you have there is amazing to cap into. So I think it's such a huge topic to talk about again, and it's so dynamic for that period of time of what you're looking at. You then talk about this idea of King Cotton, and obviously, and this also goes into American expansionism, and this image to me is always one of the most interesting ones because it deals with Veracruz, a place that most Americans, United States people, don't know much about, but it has such a long history as the gateway to Mexico, and the concept of the geography of Mexico, why Veracruz is so important. So I was wondering you talk a little bit about that American expansion, its interaction with Mexico as its new neighbor in the South.
Yeah, well, yes. So, after the Lafitte's are cleaned out and the British are defeated and Louisiana's a state, the South begins to boom with cotton in the early 19th century. The Gulf really emerges as a critical commercial corridor of a different kind. No longer is it slaves, it's still slaves, but cotton really becomes the dominant commodity as opposed to gold or silver coming out of Mexico. And New Orleans, Mobile were the booming cotton ports of the early 19th century, and had a very large maritime trade. Mobile was the third largest city in the U.S. by 1860, and or the third busiest rather in terms of trade, behind New Orleans and New York. Charleston was even further behind than that. So these ships developed these packet ships were developed to handle the cotton trade, and packet ships were basically just sailing ships of various types that were commissioned to sail to the cotton ports and load up on bales and maybe passengers too, and bring them back out and run on a regular schedule. So I really looked at the whole development of packet ships and how those grew, and how New York became critical to that trade and really grew to dominate the cotton trade in the South, and sort of the triangle between New York and Europe and the American South. And then how just that slave wealth and that cotton wealth just really transformed the region. And as the region grew more powerful, cotton became more important, U.S. interests really became quite overwhelming in the Gulf Basin. And of course, we declare war on Mexico in the late 1840s. Texas, breaks away as an independent republic, and there's a lot of interest in joining the U.S. And so in the midst of all that, there sits Veracruz, which was perhaps Mexico's most important cotton port, and a very attractive target, because once the Mexican War begins, the President Polk realizes, we've got to take the capital to win this war. It's not just enough to win battles along the border. And he didn't particularly want General Scott to do that because or General Taylor, because they were in this fierce rivalry, and he thought Taylor might, be a political threat. So he decided, well, I'll send Scott to Veracruz, and, we'll do a joint naval operation. We'll do a maritime amphibious assault on Veracruz, and then they'll go overland. It's a much shorter distance to the capital of Mexico there than from the border. And so in 1847, the Americans launched this remarkable amphibious assault on Veracruz. And here we see an image of that. And of course, as military historians know, an amphibious assault is one of the most difficult operations to execute, the other being withdrawal in the face of an armed enemy. And so here we see a depiction of, that's the castle of San Juan de Ulloa there on the right, which is a little citadel there in the harbor of Veracruz. You see the American ships lined up and assaulting it, and then the American troops landing on what were called surf boats. And what was really interesting, these surf boats were contracted and built on the Gulf Coast, and they were actually, this whole operation was really beautifully planned if you study it. And I know they studied it in colleges and military schools until, if not still, fairly recently. These surf boats were constructed to nestle in groups of three. So you had one larger, slightly smaller again, sort of maximize your space on board ship. And, they were all very interchangeable in their oars and equipage. And they were organized about, well, who's going to carry the horses, which ones are going to carry the men, which ones are going to carry the fodder and the equipment. So it was all really quite beautifully organized and planned and executed. And the Americans were able to quite successfully surround the city, besiege it for a brief period of time, and then ultimately conquer it and then move inland for the famous assault at I never can say that, Chapultepec there, Chapultepec at Mexico City, and and win the war. There were also confrontations at places like Tampico on a far lesser scale, but Veracruz was absolutely critical to gaining control not only of the Gulf but the Mexico as well, being able to attack the capital.
And ironically, I think I could have gotten a picture up here of the U.S. Navy in 1914 doing the same thing again against Mexico. And I think you raised two great points there. I just want to really build on is the boat construction here, which is just absolutely problematic for the Gulf Coast. And later on, I always think about Andrew Jackson Higgins, who's building the Higgins boats for World War II, another Gulf guy, and you see kind of the same thing right here is using the technology that's being used in the Gulf. Later on, they build the Amtrak that's used by the Marines in World War II that are used in Florida to get around the Everglades and that area. So very, very interesting aspect here. And again, the Mexican-American War, Polk once finally takes Mexico City, or Scott takes Mexico City, Polk wants to take all of Mexico. I mean, he literally almost had a period there where the entire Gulf Coast would have fallen under the United States.
Amazing.
And
again, when you really look, as a result of that war, we got Arizona, New Mexico, California, Utah, Nevada. That was all considered part of Mexico then as well. So we got a fair chunk of it as it was.
You do, and you see the breakaway of the Yucatan at this time. There's a lot of internal issues going on at this period of time. It's a really interesting dynamic that we see going on. The next chapter you had, I think, is a really interesting one because it talks about the violent sea. And I know, living in North Carolina, we worry about hurricanes all the time. And my advantage of being in North Carolina with a hurricane is I've got the Atlantic Ocean there, and so water can move off in everything. In the Gulf of Mexico, it doesn't. You're in a basin, and I don't think people ever realize that when a hurricane, the likes of a Katrina or Maria, come in, it just piles water into the Gulf and pushes it up, and it's such a unique area for this. I have a friend who teaches a public administration class. And I always go in and talk about the hurricane that hits Galveston in 1900. So I was wondering if you talk about some of the violent aspects of the Gulf of Mexico.
And actually, the chapter Violent Sea is really about the human confrontations on the Gulf rather than the weather. But the 1914 siege of Veracruz and U-boats and et cetera, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. The weather is critical to everything to do with the Gulf, and there are two predominant phenomena that that tend to get mariners' attentions in the Gulf of Mexico. One are the northers, and that's what you see a depiction of here, a wonderful painting by an American artist named Thomas Moran in the 1880s. And he was on a trip from Havana to Tampico, and he got caught in one of these northers, and this was the result. Northerner is basically just an Arctic cold front that's barreling down through the American South and then out over the Gulf and all the way. And it drops temperatures, and it just creates these mountainous waves and just these phenomenal wind speeds. Straight line winds can be, hurricane force. And the descriptions of them are just awesome to read, because not only is it blowing like hell, but it's incredibly cold and getting colder. Libby Custer, I start with a little description by her of getting caught in a norther off Galveston in about 1867. And she said, the Gulf of Mexico is always a tempest in a teapot. The waves are, lashing with tornadic fleetness from Florida to Mexico and back again. And these things would come through, and the old timers could recognize the meteorological clues, the muggy, incredibly clammy atmosphere, the stone and so forth on the shore is sweating with the condensation, and the sky has just this heavy leaden look. You have these vivid sunsets, and then just this damn front barrels through, and it can drop the temperature 25 or 30 degrees in a matter of hours. And of course, those winds just create all this mountainous waves that ships had to deal with. Of course, the other phenomena are the hurricanes, which can come up out of the Caribbean. They can boil up in the Gulf itself, or more likely, Cape Verde storms are some of the most fearsome out in the Atlantic, come off the Atlantic in tropical waves off Africa, clear across, and then up through into the Gulf. And so these storms have just been lashing our coast for centuries and have often changed the course of human events. Tristan de Luna's fleet, I saw you had a podcast on the shipwrecks they found in Pensacola Bay, Emmanuel Point, and so forth. I mean, that fleet was wrecked by a hurricane, and really Spanish hopes to successfully colonize Florida came to naught. Galvez, in his first attempt to invade Pensacola in 1780, got caught in a hurricane, Solano's storm it's called, after the name of the admiral, and the fleet gets caught out there in the Gulf and just scattered and wrecked, and thousands are drowned. And it probably would have derailed that entire strategy had it been anyone other than Galvez, but he was determined to put together another force and ultimately succeeded. So, and then of course Katrina, which has had such profound impacts on the Gulf and settlement patterns in places in New Orleans like the Lower Ninth Ward and flooding. And we're in the season now. We've already had one tropical storm. So as the season advances, Gulf residents tend to pay more and more attention. The old mariners used to say in reference to hurricane season that June was too soon. July, stand by. August, you must. September, you'll remember. October, all over. So the worst storms do tend to be in September, when the tropics are really heated, and they tend to be far more violent. Then by October, you start to get the dominance of these cold fronts coming through, which drop the temperature of the water and the atmosphere. And but then throughout the winter, you have the phenomenon of northers. So for people trying to trade or travel in the Gulf, they sort of have to continually be aware of this calendar, so that the cotton packets, when they're coming in the late autumn and in the fall, when the cotton's mature and harvested and coming down these rivers like the Mississippi and the Mobile on steamboats, it's got to be ferried across the Gulf and out across the Atlantic. And we're talking about hurricane season much of the time. And so there are many stories of cotton vessels being wrecked, and almost every place has a story about one of these kind of catastrophes. And their forecasting techniques were not particularly sophisticated then. They tended to look at the barometer and rely on a weather eye to try to predict it. But there were definitely something to be contended with.
And that's a big irony, is of course the very first cotton coming into the ports right there to be shipped out is right in that peak time, and that's also the most valuable cargo. The first one to get it across to the mills in England and Flanders and up to New England is going to get the most money. And as usual, the mariners are the ones who are on the cusp there, trying to make some money. I'm glad you mentioned about the
always.
U-boats coming in the Caribbean. I just had Tane
Yes.
Casserly from NOAA's Monitor Marine Sanctuary, and we were just talking about U-boat attacks off the East
Right.
Coast and North Carolina coast in World War II. And we mentioned right after they pacify that area and get patrols in there, the U-boats shift and move right into the Gulf of
Yeah.
Mexico. And the amount
Oh,
of
yeah.
wrecks littering the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico in that area is just phenomenal. It's
Yeah.
amazing numbers out there.
Very true. I mean, I think 56 American vessels were sunk in the latter half of 1942 alone. They only ultimately got one U-boat during the course of the war. One of the interesting stories I thought was Hemingway, Papa, tried to join the American effort against the U-boats, and he was living in Cuba, of course, at the time, and he got the permission of the Americans to fly the American flag on his fishing boat, the Pilar, which I've seen, by the way. It's in Havana. And I mean, it's a beautiful boat, but it ain't something I'd think of attacking a U-boat in. But Papa's elaborate plan was he was going to lure the U-boat to the surface under the pretense of getting fresh fish, and then he would machine gun the crew and drop hand grenades down the conning tower and make a win. And I thought, it's a good thing he never found a German sub, because the world would have been deprived of his literary skill.
How Hemingway didn't kill somebody, by the way, is just that's a whole story unto itself. I have a feeling there was a little bit of drinking going on the PLR
A
a few
lot of
times too.
drinking, yeah.
I'm pretty
Be
sure.
sure,
Uh,
sure.
you talk about the American Sea, and obviously that's a big dominant feature that we see
Yeah.
happen in the Gulf of Mexico, and this imagery right here talks about American steamship lines, United Fruit, Likes Lines,
Yeah.
Waterman. Of course, the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914
Oh, yeah.
changes things a lot. So I was wondering you talk a little bit about that influence there, which
Yeah.
is pretty
Yeah. And in
significant.
fact, Jack's book, he really talks about the making of the American Sea, and he doesn't focus at all really much on Mexico or Cuba. But yes, by the early 20th century, America is dominant within the basin, as their gunboat diplomacy there at Veracruz in 1914 would prove. And trade with the Caribbean becomes really important for ports like Tampa, New Orleans, Mobile. Tampa really explodes that time. Houston as well, the discovery of oil and the development of petroleum resources in the Gulf. Then, of course, the fisheries, which are so important. But this map shows the United Fruit lines running down to their banana plantations in Nicaragua and Caribbean, and then they also come down from the East Coast. But if you look at the cultural history of cities like New Orleans and Mobile, you can see how close they were. There's just so much memory within families and so forth about, oh, grandpa used to go down to the banana docks when the fruit ships would come in and get the leavings, which would be left, and we'd have free bananas for a week. And these fruiters, I've even talked to old pilots who talked about how much they love to guide the fruiters in. There were these pretty little white-hulled steamships, and they were just a gem, just a delight to be at the helm of. And after they'd steer the vessel into the port, the grateful captain would give them a stalk of bananas to take home. And then there's stories of people finding monkeys or tarantulas within these stalks. But what made this really work on the northern end was that elaborate railroad network, which had become fully developed by the early 20th century. So you could bring the bananas in on these little fast fruiters and then immediately get them on cars and ship them to all points. And Americans just had this insatiable appetite for fruit. So the banana trade was hugely important. And then, of course, that gets into the banana wars and American diplomacy and so forth in Latin America. But ports like Mobile and New Orleans just benefited tremendously from that trade. So again, you have this economic shift from cotton, and you get more into bananas, you get into timber, the lumber industry becomes a huge deal. And then, of course, the lumber schooners and steamers are taking it and bringing it up from Latin America and back and forth. And so that's a very robust trade. And then tourism really begins to develop too, not just on the American coast with sport fishing and things like that, but people who want to go to the Caribbean and can even buy a ticket on one of these little fruiters and run down to sort of explore the Caribbean or Cuba. And so that was a tremendously profitable line for a lot of companies. But America was dominant in the Gulf. It was not interested in tolerating any kind of foreign influence, and very much had its way.
It was really interesting. The United Fruit Company and like I said, companies like Likes Line, Central Gulf, Plant Line, and quite a few but very fast ships, the fruiters, white
Oh
because
yeah.
we wanted to keep them cool. They had to get airflow into the holds to keep them, and just the whole idea of
Yeah.
how bananas are introduced in the United States is a subset that we don't tend
Yeah.
to think about too much. But
Yes.
you're right about the rail lines. It's really a precursor for the modern version of intermodalism of how we
Yeah.
move cargo today
Yeah.
is really that way, and we see
Yeah.
that being done there really early in. I want
Yeah.
to get to your last little chapter here because I want to kind of wrap up on this on our time frame. So your last chapter is entitled Blowout, and I know what
Right.
that's referred to, but I'll leave it to you to talk about it, which is probably the most horrific thing that's happened to the Gulf Coast in the near present.
Yeah, I think Katrina and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill together really put the Gulf Coast on the map for many Americans. In both cases, because of the threat to our petroleum resources, people just didn't realize how much of our oil and gas came out of the Gulf of Mexico. And so in the case of a hurricane, you have to close these offshore platforms and evacuate the crews. In the case of the blowout at Deepwater Horizon, they were really working at the limit of technology, like 13,000 feet deep. As I say in the book, it was almost like they had pricked a primordial Mayan storm god and incurred its wrath because just this thing blew out. It was clear BP didn't have any clue how to deal with it. We'll probably never know how many gallons of oil or barrels of oil were ultimately spilled. I think the generally agreed figure is around 3.6 million barrels, but it could be much higher than that. Some scientists say so, but the damage that was done to the environment, to the food webs, will probably be years fully discovering what that is. It was obvious that our dependence on oil, whether it be foreign or domestic, carried a very high price, and that residents of the Gulf Coast were really on the front line of this, so that you had just devastating economic fallout after that oil spill. Not just the the fishermen and the people who couldn't do charters out there anymore, but people who sold RVs in New Orleans and Mobile. Nobody was coming down. Tourism dried up. T-shirt shop owners in coastal towns, places like Destin, and then you had incidences of oil actually slathering the beaches, and people. I remember there were days here where when the wind was right, it smelled like diesel in downtown Mobile, and you just thought, how are they going to stop it? When's it going to end? What the hell are we going to do going forward? And so I really wanted to sort of look at not just the environmental consequences, but the economic consequences, and how critical this industry was to the entire nation, and how the Gulf was absolutely a piece of that. And then going even further, something to which the oil companies and exploration have contributed, this idea of land loss, which we've heard more and more about, and not just rising sea levels, which are part of the story, but all these canals, exploration canals that they've dug through the delta of Louisiana to get from wellheads and run pipelines and things like that. And there's just been so much erosion. All of that played a part in the storm surge at places like New Orleans after Katrina. Mr. Go, the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, just this Arrow Strait Canal allowed the Gulf water in, and it had eroded its banks over the years before the hurricane. So it contributed in a very detrimental way to the storm surge. People realize, what we do to the environment, what we do to our landscape is very much affecting our ability to make a living and prosper here. And I sort of really closed by looking at the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw Indians, this Native American group down there at Isle de Jean Charles, Louisiana, who have literally gotten a $50 million payout from the federal government to relocate further inland because of land loss due to all of these factors. And so they're trying to desperately, it's a small group, less than 100, but they're trying to hold on to their tribal identity and resettle up near Houma, Louisiana, on land. Their prerequisites are, we got to have water. Water's critical to our culture and our way of life. And it was one of those guys said, I'd do the same thing now at 70 I did when I was 10, and catch some shrimp, laugh with my friends. And so the Gulf and the environment were absolutely critical to their sense of who they were. And, I think the culture at large here faces that as well, because we think, how are we going to sustain ourselves on a coast if it's prone to these kind of environmental and economic disasters, not to mention storms, which seem to be getting fiercer with global warming. So, these are factors that affect our very existence.
But I think you raise a great point with that too. I have a good friend, John Conrad, wrote a book on the Deepwater Horizon, which was really
Yeah.
just a batch of hubris with entities in there working. And and now we see, with shale companies, we see the decline in the maritime offshore oil, petroleum. That's impacted a lot of people. We've seen bankruptcies for offshore vessel companies. And so we really see the Gulf Coast undergoing a big change. I remember being down in Pensacola in 2011 for a NASO conference, and still finding, we're finding oil on the beaches there. And it's just, the impact is, if you're seeing drops on a beach, that's telling you there's a lot out in the ocean. So that impact is quite significant. John, I want to ask you about upcoming projects. What are you working on now? When I say John Sledge is a prolific writer, I'm not kidding. 6 books since 2006. You're a man who comes out with a book about every 2 years. I am extremely jealous of that ability.
Well, you're kind. I'm slowing down, I'm afraid, in my dotage. But what I'm working on now is a book about the relationship between Havana and Mobile, which is of long standing. I mean, it goes back to Mobile's founding, really, in the 18th century. D'Iberville, our founder, actually died in Havana of yellow fever in 1706 and is buried there. Went down with the group last fall from Mobile. We're a sister city with Havana, have been since 1993. And that trip was just an eye-opener to me, to the magnificence of the architecture, the warmth of the people, and of course the dire situation that they find themselves in now for various reasons. But I really wanted to do a book that would look at those ties going all the way back to the beginning, because Havana was celebrating its 500th anniversary then, and Mobile had celebrated its 300th, and sort of bring it forward. Cuban baseball had Mobile roots, and of course, the blockade runners and people like Raphael Sims and Madame Levert. I mean, so many Americans went to Havana and Cuba in the 19th century. It was so integrated with our economy and our culture, particularly on the Gulf. And so I'll be collaborating with a couple of photographers, one American, one Cuban, and then also a Cuban historian. And we've had some good endorsements from the cultural offices and mayors of both cities, and hopefully we can pursue that. Of course, I think we're going to have to wait for the pandemic to calm down, but I've really been fascinated to sort of explore those linkages.
It's so interesting to see that cross-pollination of cultures and societies in there. And I got to imagine the Gulf Coast, if you ran from Tampa through Mobile to New Orleans to Galveston to Tampico, all the way around, you do definitely find influences among all those cities together.
Absolutely.
I think that's fantastic. Well, I want to thank our guest, John Sledge, for joining us for our NASO video podcast. John is I said before, a prolific author, and I want to thank John for just a second. We're filming this on July 2nd. We're coming up, obviously, onto American Independence Day. I had the privilege for a long time to teach down at Camp Lejeune with my university, so I got to teach a lot of young Marines, and one of the books I used continually in the class was his father. We mentioned his father a few times, and that's Eugene Sledge. And if that name sounds familiar to you, Eugene Sledge was featured in the Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, The Pacific, but more importantly, he wrote what is one of the seminal biography books of a Marine in World War II, which is With the Old Breed. So I want to thank you, John, for your family service, and I think it's a great attribute that you're continuing in his footsteps, and even going to Auburn and doing that. So I think it's been a pleasure to have you. We will have links to all of John's works, and again, there's a lot of them, in the show notes for you to take a look at. If you liked our video and podcast, be sure to click on like on YouTube or give it 5 stars on your podcast provider. Please subscribe to our channel to receive updates as we continue to interview maritime historians. You can follow NASO on Facebook or on Twitter at NASO_history. The best way to follow NASO is to become a member. As such, you receive our newsletter, our quarterly journal, The Northern Mariner, which we publish jointly with the Canadian Nautical Research Society. You can go to www.naso.org and click on membership to join. Until our next talk, keep sailing.